Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Welcome in, welcome. We are so thrilled to see you all here today to learn how to protect your org from PrintNightmare. Before I hand it over to Greg and Steve, I would like to briefly remind y'all that with PrinterLogic's serverless solution, you can centrally manage direct IP printing and eliminate print servers while easily updating and deploying new devices from a single pane of glass. Before I toss it over to Greg and Steve, I want to briefly go over our agenda. We will start off with a question just to get everyone chatting, and they will intro themselves briefly. They'll get into what exactly PrintNightmare is, talk about the fix and was it really a fix, and talk about what the long-term solution is, and then we'll host a Q&A here at the end. So without further ado, Greg and Steve, take it away.
Perfect. Hey, thanks, Katie. We know everyone's coming back from lunch and there may be some stragglers. So we thought kicking off with just a fun question, give people extra time to connect, but also get people just interested in participating. And then real quick, Katie, I think there's a block kind of hiding some of our slides. Yeah, there we go. If we get rid of that. But the cool question that we wanted to ask is what is the coolest thing you've done with a Raspberry Pi? I think this is the right audience, hopefully, to ask that question too. So it could be something you've done, something that you've seen done with a Raspberry Pi, but go ahead and just share. If you hit the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom, let's see what the coolest thing out there. I think with the 70+ attendees, there's got to be something pretty neat out there. So as you guys are typing in, I'll introduce myself real quick. I'm Steve Kelly. I've been here at Vasion, formerly known as PrinterLogic, for about 8 years. Started as a system engineer, but tried a few different other roles here internally, and currently am the head of enterprise sales. And I'll let Greg here introduce himself as well.
Yep, I'm Greg Smith. I'm the principal architect on the pre-sale side here at Vasion. I work with primarily our global customers and strategic accounts, building out the right architecture for the solution and just helping them solve any challenge that come up. My background is in software engineering and IT, so I've kind of done a little bit of everything, and here I am on the primarily the pre-sale side, but like I said, I'm kind of all over the place. So.
Thanks, Greg. And we're real grateful to have Greg on the call and really glad that everybody took some time to join in and learn a little bit more about PrintNightmare. Greg and myself have worked with a broad set of different customers, from large federal agencies down to the commercial and private sector, and even some mom and pop shops. So we have a pretty good feel for how PrintNightmare's impacted all of us. And what we wanted to get out of today's call is really 3 things. We want everybody to walk away with a better understanding of what PrintNightmare was, and more specifically, why was it different? It's not every day that we hear a print vulnerability hit the news cycle, and you see it on CNN and Fox News, and so there was something different about that, and we want to make sure everybody had a chance to understand the what and the why. The second thing we want everybody to walk away with today is understanding why PrintNightmare is not going to be an isolated event, why PrintNightmare 2.0 is just around the corner. And the third and final thing we really want everyone to walk away with is understanding what a potential long-term solution would look like to completely avoid those headaches or to be trope those nightmares. So with that, I'll go ahead and tee up Greg here. Just Greg, I think all of us have heard of PrintNightmare. Nobody's coming to this call completely unaware of what it is. But as I mentioned, it was different. We hit a news cycle. It's something for over a year now that a lot of us are still dealing with the ramifications of. So help unpack for us, why was it different? Why was it such a severe vulnerability?
So there was really, when all this started coming out, there was a lot of confusion around what PrintNightmare was, right? And so if you were following the cycle, there were a couple of CVEs, some publicly disclosed vulnerability reports. And there were really 2 primary vulnerabilities that exist in PrintNightmare. One was a remote code execution vulnerability, and another one was a local privilege escalation vulnerability. And the reason why this was such a big deal, right, and it specifically targeted the print spooler, right, a shared print spooler service. So when you think about where that print spooler is in the organization and what it's responsible for doing, it's running as a super elevated privilege, right? It's running as local system. So basically it can do anything. and it's responsible for distributing drivers to other print spoolers in the organization, right? Other workstations. And those print spoolers are also running as local system, right? So it was really the severity of the issue as well as the breadth of the issue, because it was not just, oh, this one server is vulnerable. By injecting malicious code into this service, that malicious code could then be transported to literally every workstation in the organization.
Okay, so if we kind of let's circle back and just make sure everybody understands here. So this wasn't something that impacted the printer itself. We're not talking paper and toner here. What we're actually talking about, PrintNightmare impacted the spooling service, what enabled a Windows workstation to actually print. And I think Greg drew out a really good point here. By attacking that print spooling service, it's something that both was easy to execute remotely, because if we think about our organizations and users that are printing through a print server, almost every workstation is going to be dependent on that print server. So you attack that service, then you have access and the ability to potentially attack all of the endpoints that are dependent on it. And then the second thing that Greg hit that I think is really important to point out is the privilege escalation. A print spooling service typically runs really low level at the workstation side, right? So if you have the ability to attack that service, you get pretty low level access to the workstation as well. You're not just looking at documents, but you're able to access registries and drivers and the actual guts of the operating system itself. So Greg, is that the only reasons why it was such a big deal? I mean, I think a lot of CVEs and vulnerabilities kind of do that, right? They try to get privilege escalation or attack endpoints. There must have been something different that still made this stand out against other potential hacks.
Yeah, I think it was the fact that all of this came out, that, like I said, there was a lot of confusion up front. There was multiple CVEs involved. And really, it was not just that one service, right? But it was the scope, right? It was an attacker could target a shared print spooler, and then that malicious code is injected and is now literally running on every workstation in the OS, right? So it was not only severe, but very, very broad in impact.
Yeah, I think the broad is very telling. One other thing I think is important is we're not talking theoretical, right? Like PrintNightmare was a real vulnerability that was actually being attacked and exploited, not something that was just discovered in a lab. And in fact, a lot of us here who have been tuning into PrintNightmare has recently noticed that the FBI and CISA, which is the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, kind of a mouthful for an agency name, but just as recently as March 2022, they documented an active exploit on an organization that targeted PrintNightmare. And the story is that a state-sponsored Russian hacking group used PrintNightmare, actively exploited it to gain that remote code execution and privilege escalation to bypass an organization's two-factor authentication. And then they used it for document exfiltration. So we kind of think about that for a minute. Here's an organization who probably thought they were doing all of the right things. I mean, if you are implementing a zero trust and a two-factor authentication system, security is obviously top of mind. It's not something you're putting on the back burner. Yet we all know that from a security perspective, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And in this scenario, PrintNightmare was the weakest link and allowed them to bypass all those other security checks. So I think that was something that was really interesting. When we talk about PrintNightmare and other vulnerabilities, sometimes you think of the lab scenarios or the research that we identified something scary, but what was different here is it just wasn't identified, it was actively exploited, and even a year later, something that's still being compromised. So Greg, even though PrintNightmare is pretty severe, we just uncovered and talked about how it's actively being exploited. Can you walk us through how organizations have been mitigating the vulnerability and patching it? What did that story or that time frame look like?
So in the beginning of the PrintNightmare saga, if you will, so when you take a look at the CVEs and Microsoft's initial response, it was really just, hey, disable the print spooler like everywhere.
Now this blows my mind. Like this is the knee-jerk reaction from Microsoft felt like the nuclear approach, right? Oh no, print spoolers hacked. Let's just turn it off. And I'm sure nobody here could relate to the moniker nightmare when they turned off the print server or the print spooler, right? I mean, this obviously was a big deal and a pretty big reaction to the vulnerability. But it was obviously that's not the long-term solution. We disable the spooler, people can't print. I mean, that stops business. If you can't print, sometimes business doesn't function. So, you know, where did we go from there? That's obviously not where things stood.
Yeah, I really think the initial reaction was really just to stop the bleeding, right? Like they know that there's this vulnerability out there. They know the severity of it. It's hitting the news cycles, right? So yeah, I understand. Let's stop the bleeding, disable the print spooler, but what's next, right? So the next thing, they start issuing series of patches, right? And it wasn't just one patch. You would think that, hey, yeah, we found the problem, we patch it. It was not just one patch. It was a patch. And then they patched the patch, and then they patched that patch, right? And so there was a series of patches that took place over the course of, I think, 2 months or so, right? So I think, you know, if we look back, it really kind of started in June, if I'm not mistaken, right? Was that initial CVE vulnerability or that initial disclosure? And then we're still dealing with patches up until August.
And I think this totally gives some insight into why, again, it was called PrintNightmare. Let's just put ourselves into anybody on this call who was a system administrator or a security engineer who was in the trenches when this CVE got released. The timeline is Microsoft sends out a bulletin saying disable your print service. Well, I know that kept a lot of us up at night. Business stopped for a lot of us until we were able to actually apply a patch, and that was a couple weeks later. So then Microsoft says, all right, you go ahead and enable your spooler again because we have this patch, but just be warned, patch is only part of it. Then it's a couple weeks later again, there's a patch to the patch. And so fine, you know, 2 months later, we go through this real painful process, disabling a spooler, re-enabling it, patching the patch. Great. Is PrintNightmare finally a thing of the past, Greg?
You would think so. And then there was the last one, right? And so I remember it was the Wednesday after Patch Tuesday, right? Patch Tuesday, Microsoft rolls out all their patches. And buried in this patch was a registry key that overrode every single group policy object or group policy extension that was targeted around, you know, print servers and security there. And it was to require administrator access to install a print driver. So I'm sure there are plenty of people on this call who woke up Wednesday morning getting a flood of help desk tickets of users getting UAC prompts, not understanding why they're having to put in administrator credentials. Like, not everybody's a local administrator on their workstations, right? Plenty of organizations have that locked down. I mean, that's security best practice is least privileged access, right? So a lot of these users, they were still in a position where they could not print. They had effectively just disabled the print spooler again because these users were in the same spot, right? Like they could not print because they were getting prompted to type in admin credentials to install a print driver. So what did all the IT guys have to do, right? Log into 20,000 workstations and put in admin credentials to get the print drivers installed or updated so that printing could once again occur.
Yeah, I think that's just a really important thing to slow down and really let set in. I think there are quite a few organizations out there. When you say PrintNightmare, they remember the past and how painful it was to get where they're at, but mentally probably think we're beyond this, right? I patched it, we got business running back up and normal. But the reality is, even with the vulnerability mitigated, and I love that I get to tie in this term to this webinar, but there's a new normal, right, in this post-PrintNightmare world. And that new normal is users who previously could install printers and drivers and help themselves with very little effort now are dependent on either having admin permissions, username and password, or they're dependent on the IT team or help desk team logging in and installing a printer for them. And that's a behavior change. That's really cumbersome from an end user, but it is a result of mitigating the vulnerability. If you want to stop a print spooler vulnerability from spreading and having low-level access, you have to lock it down. So that may feel like kind of a forced situation for a lot of these organizations. This is our new normal. It's just going to be painful to get users to print anymore. But Greg, I want to see, is there any other solution besides just now requiring users to type in username and passwords? Is there some other way to both mitigate for this vulnerability, but also get that nirvana where users can help themselves?
Yeah. So, and I think just to kind of tie back into that last point, I think part of the problem for IT was that this was just a new normal that got thrust upon them with no warning whatsoever, right? And I think that was it was just, we were in shock that we now were faced with this thing that we weren't prepared for, right? Very much like when COVID hit and everybody's working from home. Guess what IT was doing? They were building VPN tunnels. They were trying to just scrounge up anything to make work happen. And this was yet another thing, right? So yeah, what do we do moving forward, right? So I kind of like Microsoft's approach ish, right, of disabling spooling from a shared spooler, right? Let's think about what the whole point of a print server originally was. It was to have central management of print queues and drivers that get pushed out to workstations. Well, there's a problem with that when you have a bunch of workstations on a network and everybody has access to that. It is a very big target, right? And to your point, this is going to happen again, right? There will be another PrintNightmare because just from the sheer aspect of, think about all of the data that goes through a shared spooling service. That is literally every single document that gets printed, right? So if you put your hacker hat on for a minute, that's a honeypot, right? If I've ever seen one, it's all of your print data. So how do we mitigate for that, right? Well, why don't we go back to what a print server was actually useful for? The centralized management and driver administration for an entire organization. But let's not have one thing in the middle that's responsible. Let's get rid of the honeypot in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Let's push that spooling logic out.
I think that's really the crux of why PrintNightmare wasn't an isolated event. Sure, that specific CVE or that specific vulnerability was an isolated incident. But Greg, what you just highlighted is the root cause of all this was a shared spooling service. And we've hit on a couple times, but just to bullet point it again of why that will continue to be an appealing attack vector for a hacker is because it has access to a lot of data. If you have a centralized print server, all of those documents, all that print data that may be sensitive is accessible from that one spooling service. And then again, it's also something that's a shared resource. You may have tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of users that are dependent on that one service. So again, it's going to be an appealing target because I know as a hacker, if I can attack that one service, I'm going to be able to quickly replicate and spread across the environment. So PrintNightmare 2.0 just definitely makes sense. It's going to be something that happens in the future. But Greg, like the one thing I can't wrap my mind around is, we're not talking about going completely paperless here. Like printing, at least for a lot of us, is going to be in our future. So how do you avoid the PrintNightmare 2.0 without disabling printing altogether? I think you kept talking about not centralizing your spooling service. What does that look like?
So think about centralized management, but push the spooling logic out to the edge where the printing is actually happening, right? So every workstation is now responsible for spooling its own documents. Those documents are then routed directly to a printer without anything in the middle that is a giant honeypot. It's not a data collector, right? It's literally just, you have a way to centrally manage which queues and which drivers are being used in workstations. And then those workstations then do their job. Users hit file print, documents are rendered on the workstation and sent directly to the printer, and there's no middleman.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people who aren't familiar with PrinterLogic and centrally managed direct IP printing mentally kind of lump together the two things that a print server does into one. Like,
right.
If you think of the legacy Microsoft print servers, you don't really decouple that. There's both spooling and there's the management. You think of a print server as it does both of those things and they exist together and dependent on each other. But the reality is that's not how it is. Just because a print server did both those things, you can have printing separate from print management. And I think that's what you're hitting on, right? Is a better way to mitigate the PrintNightmare 2.0 is get rid of the centralized spooling, but we're not talking about getting rid of the centralized management.
Exactly.
So how does PrinterLogic actually do the centralized management? We get, all right, we put the spooler at the edge of the individual workstation, but there's still all those other things that the print server used to do. What are some of those things, and how does PrinterLogic handle it?
Well, and that's a really good point, right? Like, so we're not talking about, okay, let's take your print spooler out of the center of your network and let's go stick it up in the cloud. That's not a solution. You're just moving the problem, right? So we don't want to do that, but we want to retain that centralized management, right? So with PrinterLogic, the way that we kind of handle this, right? We've got that SaaS-based management console where you as the administrator, you log in, you can secure this any way that you want, right? Whatever IDP you're using, whether that's, on-premise LDAP, whether that's Azure AD, whether that's Okta, whether that's Jump Cloud, or any of the amazing identity providers we have, secure that with two-factor, multi-factor authentication if you want, because all that's handled at the IDP side. Once you have access to the admin console, you define the print queues that are in your organization, you associate signed type 3 drivers to those print queues, and then your boots on the ground, right? Remember the day after Patch Tuesday, everybody having to log in and with admin credentials? Mm-hmm. Well, now you've got an agent on the workstations that's doing all of that heavy lifting for you, right? And so that agent checks in, hey, what print queues do I need? What drivers are associated? It pulls them down, it installs them on behalf of the user. No admin credential, you don't have to do any of that because you've already done that in the admin console. You've already made those print definitions, and the client agent just does what it needs to do to enable print.
So I think that really bullet points the unique approach that PrinterLogic has, and it is, you still get all that centralized management that you would expect from a print server now in the cloud, but to really mitigate not only the risk of PrintNightmare, but PrintNightmare 2.0 is get rid of that centralized spooling service. And we're not talking about taking that print server spooler and just hosting it in AWS or Azure. It's truly getting rid of that. And now we could kind of compare and contrast those alternatives. If you think of that centralized print spooler being a single point of attack that quickly replicates and all the access to the data you get, and then contrast that to individual local spoolers on all those individual workstations, to get the same level of insight and the same level of data exfiltration, somebody would have to have each individual workstation spooler. And that is a lot better mitigation approach than just throwing it up in the cloud. So I really love you walking through that. And that's the takeaway that we hope everybody really gets out of this webinar. Maybe you came into this call, you've seen PrinterLogic before, and maybe you went straight to the reasons of eliminating my print servers is because I have a cloud strategy, or because of the return on investment, or maybe you go straight to just the man hours saved from not managing print servers anymore. But I think what PrintNightmare's forced a lot of people to do is take another look at another reason why we need to get rid of print servers. And that is because it reduces your attack surface. And it's not just theoretical or trope, but now we have a real world scenario, active exploitation of what happens when you don't eliminate your print server. And no secure environment is going to be 100% hack proof, but this absolutely is a way to mitigate your exposure, and specifically around the print spooling service, without losing all of that centralized management that you need to stay operationally efficient. So with that, I know we got about 15 minutes here to where we wanted to leave some time for Q&A. And so the way we'd like the Q&A to go is, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a separate button. There's the chat button, but for Q&A, there's a separate button. If you actually use that, it helps out a ton, simply because me and Greg can mark off the ones that we've answered. And in the chat, it's just this running log, a little bit of a nightmare. But I'll give everybody a chance here to type in a few questions, and what we'll use for a little bit of filler is maybe review some of our survey results here of the coolest Raspberry Pi builds. Katie, I think you had a chance maybe to scroll through a couple, any that you wanted to call out.
Yeah, Steve, you'll appreciate this one. Someone's hooked a Raspberry Pi up to their 3D printer.
Nice.
Someone's used Pi-hole DNS ad blocker I see a lot of people using it for ad blocker. One person said, eat it, LOL. And one person said an Octa printer. And then of course, the classic option, retro arcade games, over 1,000. Yeah.
Automated garden watering and lighting. So James Stark, is that homegrown, or you may have to type in what open source tools you're using? That sounds pretty legit right there.
I've been needing to do that. So yes, I'm very interested in that solution.
I saw somebody, a gate opener. That's also that is pretty neat. I see that there, I think I'm using my Raspberry Pis right. Octoprint, definite call out there. Behind this green screen, there's a big 3D printer being monitored by Octoprint. So love to see others using that. Private open VPN server, cool. So yeah, I appreciate people throwing some things in there. I'm still gonna call out James here, man. Definitely type in how we get access to that. Oh, developed himself, nice, all right. All right, so Q&A here. We've got a couple questions coming in. Thanks, Mitch, for that comment. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck? He could definitely chuck more if he doesn't have print servers that he's trying to patch. I know.
Absolutely. One person asked, how does this integrate with a VMware environment?
Ah, that's a great question. So that question could come from two different angles. You may be coming from a published application side or a VDI solution that's hosted in VMware. Great news is complete integration. And we actually give you a couple options. If you're using, there's two ways to really print inside a VMware or VDI environment. That would either be printer redirection or session-based printing, and we support both. You can either deploy our agent, which will manage printers inside the VMware environment, or we even have some integrations with zero and thin clients with iGel or Wise clients, where we can manage printers directly there and then use the ICA channel to redirect them in. So a very, very popular way of using the PrinterLogic solution is definitely getting users the ability to install printers, even if they're in a VDI or host application session. Great question. Anything else that's coming up?
Yeah. Do you need a computer on at all times in order for PrinterLogic to work? If yes, and there are multiple customer locations, what are the implications? How can I determine if they need multiple computers on at all times?
Oh man, that is such a great question for our principal architect here, Greg. Can you give everybody just a quick breakdown of, we talked about eliminating that central spooling service. We talked about how you can manage it from a central console, but give us a little bit more insight to the architecture.
So yeah, when the admin console, I think it really all starts there, right? Because that's where you're going to define your print queues and what drivers you're going to use, right? And so when you're setting all that up for the first time, obviously you can define things manually, but we realize a lot of organizations are moving from a print server based architecture. So right out of the gate, we give you some tools to automatically import those print queues and those drivers into PrinterLogic. Without,
in this scenario, where does PrinterLogic exist? Is it a server that they're hosting in their environment, or is it somewhere else?
No, it's literally just a cloud-based SaaS or SaaS-based admin console. So you're logging into PrinterLogic from a web page, right? And you're administering, you're setting everything up there first, right? And it's only until when you start rolling out the client agent, that's when magic starts to happen in your organization. And the way that we're using this agent, you can. When we're going through a trial, for instance, we typically will pilot this on a small subset of computers, typically restricted to the IT department, because the last thing that we want to do as an organization is just, flip all the tables in your organization. Okay, now we're bringing a new way, right? No, we want to guide you through the process, right? So deploy the agent out just in a very controlled way, do your testing, make sure it's meeting your needs. But no, I mean, basically when the agent comes up, it's checking in with the admin console saying, hey, what do you have for me, right? And the admin console will tell it, okay, based on your IP address or your username or your group membership, you need these queues, here are the drivers, and the agent just silently installs those on behalf of the user. The other way that users can get printers is through the self-service portal, which is kind of enabled when you install that agent. And so they can go to the self-service portal, even if you haven't defined any automated print queue installation, whatever, they can go to the self-service portal, see a floor plan map, see where all the printers are in their organization. They have one-click installation capability.
Yeah.
And it's truly a self-service type of thing where they don't have to authenticate at all because you've already set everything up. They get whatever driver is associated with that print queue that you as the administrator have set up.
Yeah, so I think get back to that specific question of do you need a workstation online or always accessible? And the answer is no. From an architecture standpoint, this is a SaaS solution. As Greg mentioned, it's just a web page that you log into. Nothing needs to be hosted inside your environment. So there's nothing that you need to maintain or keep online for printing services to happen. Now, Greg keeps referencing to an agent. We do have a web client that gets deployed down to workstations. That's simply the management hook. So it reaches up to the SaaS instance and just says, here's my user account. What printers or drivers do I need installed? But there's nothing on site or locally that you are hosting or maintaining to keep print services going. And here's a cool fun fact, because spooling happens locally, let's take your worst case scenario. You have a WAN outage or a VPN that goes down, or for whatever reason, AWS isn't accessible. Printing still actually functions. Because printing happens between the workstation and that printer, you don't even need that access to that SaaS instance to make sure printing continues to happen. And I'm going to use that to segue into a really good question that kind of follows up for that. Someone's asking about the PrinterLogic client and how does it grant privileges to install drivers locally if you've patched PrintNightmare? So if we kind of go back to the beginning of this call, we talked about the remediation or the patching of PrintNightmare disables a user's ability to install a printer on their own. They now have to type username and password. In the PrinterLogic world, that's not the case. That agent, that web agent that I described, it is actually running under its own system level context. It's not dependent on the end user's permissions. So if you've patched PrintNightmare and your user cannot install a driver today, or they have to type in a username and password, if you implement the PrinterLogic solution from day one, they will be able to start installing printers without you undoing any of those patches. They at no time ever need that administrative level access, and they won't be asked for username or passwords. And that's really just because of the power of that local agent.
Yeah, and I also want to just to kind of piggyback on that, Steve. The patches that came out patched a very specific Microsoft technology called point and print. That is a distribution mechanism from a print server to a workstation whereby drivers get installed on that workstation. That is what the patch targets in terms of requiring administrator access to install drivers, right? So PrinterLogic doesn't use that point and print mechanism whatsoever. This is a mechanism that's been, this has been in Windows since like, I don't know, 2000. It's been there forever. So we're not leveraging that at all, right? We're not leveraging any RPC calls to install, drivers from whatever. This is just the client downloading the driver that you have installed and installing it locally on the workstation, doing the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great insight. And I think one question that we get that's relevant to the agent is, what about mobile devices? Does PrinterLogic support mobile printing where you can't install like a native client agent? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We have Android, Chromebook, and iOS support for printing through an application that's deployed. So not an agent, but just native app. But one of the really neat things about the PrinterLogic printing app is it uses the native built-in printing service. So users aren't going from their email or from their internet app, exporting it and importing into an app, but rather with the PrinterLogic app installed, they will be able to use the native iOS print or the native Android or Chromebook printing functionality, and PrinterLogic will simply load the available printers that are there for them. So it's a very conducive end user experience. Even users who don't like context switching through different apps really like the way we've approached mobile printing. Great. So really got the questions cooking now. Kate, you may have to help me out here. Is there another one that you may have tagged?
Yeah. Going back to the agents really quickly, how about agents for Mac OS or possibly Linux?
Really good question. So we understand the modern IT environment is demanded to support more than just Windows. And PrintNightmare was, of course, a Windows-specific CVE, but that is not the limitation of our support. We support Mac OS X, iOS, Android, Linux, VDI sessions. We talked about thin clients, zero clients. Really, any modern way of an end user interacting with print is a way that we support. Yep. And maybe I'll piggyback on that, because a common question we get following up that is, great, you support all those different endpoints, but what kind of printers do you support? Same answer. If the printer has an IP address, we can support it. Great question.
Okay, so I think that leads in great to this question about, are there limitations in terms of print job sizes? My company has an extensive AutoCAD install base and prints large CAD drawings.
Yeah, the answer is no, not really. Just the limitation of the OS. If Windows was able to print out that CAD document with us in managing those print queues, same thing. They'll still be able to print.
Yeah, as long as, so the only thing I'll point out there is we use signed type 3 drivers, right? So if your large format has a signed type 3 driver that leverages the Windows spooler to, the local Windows spooler print jobs, we can use it.
Yeah, great. And I see a good one here to answer next. It asks, do end users manage their own default printer, or is that controlled in the SaaS offering? The answer to this is an answer you'll see throughout a lot of the different parts of the product. And the answer is, it depends how you configure it. Because we find that every business has a unique use case. So we think of default printing. If you want to control it from the administrator level and force that on an end user, we see this a lot with school districts where they want to force teachers default printer to be the copy room. The answer is yes, you can absolutely change that. And you can even configure the solution to check if the user overwrit that and change it back. But then we take the opposite approach as well. If you're an organization who have picky users that want to have complete control of their default printer, we can take a hands-off approach as well.
Or we can set it once, right? And then if a user overrides it, hey, that's fine, right? So definitely mix and match of what you can do there. And with the self-service portal, let's say you're in your organization, IT has pushed out, say, a set of default printers for you in your building, right? But maybe the printer you need has not been automatically deployed. That's where the self-service portal comes in, right? So you just right-click the agent, add a printer, pulls up a map, find the printer you want. As long as you have access to see that printer and install the driver and all that sort of thing, you just click on install printer. The agent automatically installs the print queue and the driver for you.
Yeah, perfect. And it looks like we're down to our last two questions. So if you have another burning a question you want answered, we got about 5 minutes, so feel free to type it in. But the next one here is, does PrinterLogic support ADFS for SSO? This is an area we've had a lot of growth and expansion lately, and we're really excited. We're one of the few vendors that has multiple identity provider support. Now, this is protocol-based support, but through SAML and just-in-time provisioning, or help me out, Greg, what's the other one?
OIDC.
ODIC, we can really support any protocol-based authentication for single sign-on. That's both within our admin console and at the printer itself. So if you're using Okta or Azure AD or Ping Federate, Google or G Suite users, Microsoft Azure AD, we can authenticate both end users and administrators all through those different identity providers. And a recent feature that is either come out or just around the corner is we can also support concurrent IDP providers. So if you're using both Azure AD and Active Directory and you're making that transition, or you're using Azure AD and you're using Okta for your MFA, we actually can support those simultaneously. So great question. One question I saw here from 2 or 3 people is, what if I do have my print server around for specialty applications? I can't just get rid of 100% of my print servers. The great news is PrinterLogic works perfectly alongside a print server. If you have an old legacy application that only prints through it, that can run in parallel with the PrinterLogic solution managing end user printing as well. Of course, that's going to still be a centralized spooler that you're going to have to worry about protecting and securing down, but you can mitigate the exposure or the attack surface by offloading end users from that print server and dedicating it just to that specialty application. Really
yes.
Well, I think that is all of our, oh, sorry, one more. What elevated permissions does the PL agent have to install printers? runs under the system context. So very similar to how your antivirus runs.
Yeah, we actually got a couple more questions coming in through the chat. They asked what can I do on my Windows print servers to prepare for a PrinterLogic migration? We plan to migrate early next year, and I want the process to go as smoothly as possible.
Sure, Greg, maybe a great one for you as a solutions architect. Just walk everybody through the standard scenario of I want PrinterLogic, I have my print server, how do I get my print queues into the solution?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So the first step is we're going to spin up a trial instance for you in our SaaS platform. You'll want to install the agent on, say, a management workstation to where you have access to basically use the agent then to connect to the print server. And what we're going to do at that point is just import your existing print queues from the print server into PrinterLogic. So this is going to take across the printer name, right, the queue name, the IP address or the FQDN of that printer, location, comment fields, what driver you're using, as well as any default settings that those drivers have. And we'll automatically ingest that into the SaaS platform. The great part is this is a non-destructive operation. We're not messing with printing locally. So while you're going through this trial process, the last thing we want to do is impact existing users. And we don't do that, right? So once those print queues are implemented or imported into PrinterLogic, at that point you go through and start making deployments, right? So to either AD user groups or IDP users or groups or IP address ranges, we've got a lot of different ways to deploy printers out to organizations or to users within organizations. And then once you want to make the switch, all you have to do is install the client agent to a workstation. That client agent will automatically transition any existing print server-based queues to managed direct IP queues without you having to lift a finger. It's very transparent to the end user, and they don't notice any difference. All that is happening is, like, instead of printing the job through the print server, it's now going direct IP to the printer.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite answers. I mean, Greg gave us the whole process and what's happening on the back end. But the reality is, what do you have to do to prepare? Nothing. Like, our development team has done such a good job creating the import utility that it takes a matter of minutes. You install the agent on your print server, you select which queues you want to import, and everything else is automatic. And as Greg highlighted, very important, it's non-destructive. So even if something goes wrong, users are still printing. A lot of organizations, they'll go ahead and onboard during the middle of business hours because there's just not any interruption to users who are printing through that print server. Great. I've seen two now questioning about port 443 or what ports are needed. With our SaaS solution, everything's really isolated down to 443. I mean, there may be some edge cases or very specific configurations that require additional ports, but in general, everything's happening through a 443 connection. That includes the client. That does even include the SAML authentication. It's all going to go through a 443 pipe between your organization and through where it's hosted in AWS. So we're not requiring Active Directory ports to be opened anymore or specific LDAP ports. It's really just 443. And that is based on a TLS connection.
Yeah, TLS 1.2.
Yeah, great. All right, Katie, did I miss anything? I think we're right on the top of the hour.
We are right on time. We finished up right when we needed to.
I'll just finish up by thanking everybody, of course, for jumping on. Hopefully this really sparks some interest for those who have been really wanting to eliminate their print server and now have just another one of many reasons to go ahead and do that. Avoid that PrintNightmare 2.0. And then we would love to get on a demonstration. I think maybe Katie can tell you a little bit more on how to engage with us if you have more questions or if you'd like to see the actual product itself.
Yeah, I just popped a link in the chat to schedule a demo if you're ready to schedule a demo. If not, there is a chat function on the website as well. You talk to a real person through that chat. So, we can hop on a demo really quick, or we can chat about it through the chat. Either way.
Yeah, so appreciate everybody taking out the time, learning with us, and hopefully we get a chance to engage with you here in the future.
Yes, thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.